February 8th. This was a bright, clear day, but we could not stir out as our shell holes are under observation of the enemy. So I sat at the entrance watching aeroplanes fighting overhead and talked to Dunham. He is an oldish and rather dirty-looking fellow with a long, drooping moustache. As a servant, he is absolutely useless, and was allotted to me by Hatwell because he would not spare a smart man from the company. Before he joined up, he was a lithographer in Dorset. He is quite well spoken and very religious, and although he makes me angry at times, he is very willing and I quite like him. We had only one meal during the day, and that of bread and bully, but we made tea 3 times with water from our bottles. At night we worked, carrying wire up to the line. Everything was perfectly quiet and peaceful all day. February 9th, day spent in the same way as yesterday. We had no food or water, but Dunham got a large chunk of ice out of a shell hole behind us, so we had some milkless tea. I was a little dubious about using shell hole water, but it was perfectly white, and I should think any germs would be frozen. I was rather cheered when a runner arrived during the afternoon with instructions for us to return to Éclusiers when night fell. On arrival, we found the rest of the battalion already installed in our original billets. When a hot meal was put before me, I attacked it like a wolf, realizing for the first time how hungry I was. February 10th to 13th. We passed the next few days in a very slack manner, doing no work but occasionally holding an inspection of rifles or gas helmets. It must be getting gradually warmer, for whilst drawing water, a fellow went through the ice, and everywhere it is beginning to crack up. Thomas, after a couple of days in bed, has gone to the hospital with rheumatic fever. February 14th, taking over the front line. Moved at dusk up the old Herbecourt Road, which is now much softer. The snow is mostly melted and slushy, but the ground underneath is still frozen. I knew the way up to Battalion HQ, of course, but from there on was new to me. It was a long and winding trench, which rather bewildered me, for the scattered sentry posts seemed to face in all directions. After a short time, the guide warned me in a whisper that we must now go quietly as we were close to the line. Then the trench got narrower and shallower until it was only knee-deep, and we ran into a broken wall of a house. The trench recommenced at the corner of the building, and here was the entrance to the cellar used as the Sergeant Major's dugout. Here we dropped Sergeant Bell to take over his duties, and we carried on down another 30 yards of deep, narrow trench, where I tore a great rent in my British warm. We hit the front-line trench at right angles, and almost opposite was another cellar into which Hatwell had disappeared in a moment. I hardly noticed the troops melting away into different directions, but suddenly found myself quite alone outside the cellar. For a quarter of an hour I sat up against the side of the trench, soaking in the atmosphere. It was quite dark and damp. Around my feet the mud was 6 inches deep, and above me I could see only the faint outline of the parapet, all jagged and broken with bricks and stumps, and over it the dim silhouette of loose wire. Occasionally a huge rat would scamper past, or a couple of men would stagger by, swearing gently at their load of sandbags or stakes. All was deathly quiet except for the low voices in the dugout or the faint click of a bayonet against a steel hat. Soon, in 2s and 3s, men began to dribble back down the way we had come, and then a sturdy sergeant major lifted the blanket of the dugout and reported in a deep, confident voice, "Relief complete, sir." He went steadily off, hoisting his rifle sling higher on his shoulder, and was lost in the darkness. A few minutes later, I descended the cellar steps to find a couple of officers finishing their drinks and putting out their cigarettes before they too said goodbye to the line for a while. When they had gone, we sat down and took a peg of whiskey each, taking stock of our surroundings. The dugout was merely the cellar of a house which had been knocked down over it. At one end, a sleeping platform covered with straw was raised a foot above the ground. Our table was immediately in front of the entrance steps, down which a stream of mud was slowly trickling. The wall nearest the enemy had been hit by a shell and was stuffed up with sandbags. Beside the door, a shaft had been dug, and in a small space, 20 feet down, I saw a candle burning and 2 signallers, one of whom, with the receivers strapped to his head, was reading a magazine. The other was preparing for sleep. Our table has been of good mahogany, but now is thickly coated with dirt and candle grease. One leg is broken and is supported on a champagne bottle. The first 4 hours of duty was to be taken by Watkins, the second by me, and the third by Hatwell. When Sergeant Bell, with a dirty bandage round his neck, lifted the blanket and looked in, Watkins rose and prepared to go. I got up too, as I wanted to see the procedure. There are 2 blankets over the steps, one having to be lowered before the second is raised, to prevent the light showing, and also as a protection against gas. Passing out of the candle light, we stood still for a moment to get our eyes accustomed to the darkness. The night was perfectly quiet, and we picked our squelchy way after Bell along the trench to the right. After 10 or 12 yards, we turned to the right, ducking under a trench board, and came to the first post. Here, with his head above the parapet, stood Private Newey, perfectly motionless. He answered our whispered questions without turning his head, and we stood beside him for a few moments peering into the darkness. Nothing could be seen or heard, and we stepped down and talked to Corporal Bobby Wood, who was in charge of the post. He showed us his shelter, a bare hole scooped out of the side of the trench. His 6 men were in a tiny shelter on one side. Leaving them to their watch, we passed on to the Lewis gun post some dozen yards away. Here Corporal Mackay, who was smoking his little pipe upside down, greeted us very cheerily and seemed quite happy. His gun was pushed forward down a little sap, along which we crept quietly to where the gunners were lying face downwards under a belt of wire, with their eyes glued on the faint outline of the ground in front. We could not talk, so we returned to the trench. The remainder of the line was very irregular, and the posts seemed to be firing in different directions. At the end of our sector on the left, a communication trench ran back to the rear, and a little way down was a nice big shelter in which Sergeant Alsop and 1 or 2 men of 14 platoon were sleeping. Close to our third post were 2 trees, one of which, stripped and shattered by a shell, was still standing. The other was cut in half and hung down across the trench like an arch. Under this ran a shallow trench, which was a shortcut back to our HQ. This trench we took, walking in the open for nearly 50 yards, which I thought a highly dangerous proceeding. We very quickly struck the main trench almost at HQ, and here I left them, re-entering the dugout to find Hatwell asleep and the servants gone. Helping myself to a large whisky and a chunk of bread and bully, I stared at Hatwell's muddy boots and thought of what I had seen. When we had been out of the line, I had despised these officers and NCOs and criticised the men, but now I realised that I was the most useless object in the company. Immediately on entry, they had quietly melted away and taken up their duties, already keenly alert and capable, and here was I, still confused, wondering and fearful. I drank several whiskies and dozed for an hour or 2, but my brain was still active and my imagination running riot. After working myself into an acute state of nerves, I dropped off to sleep, but was almost immediately wakened by Watkins, who told me it was time for me to go on duty. I waited for a few minutes, then, as my sergeant did not arrive, I went out alone into the trench, where the eerie influences of the night descended upon me. It was deathly still. The mud, the smell of earth, the ragged sandbags, the gruesome litter numbed my brain. A cold fear chilled my spine and set my teeth chattering. I stood shaking and gazing horrified into the darkness, thinking, "This is war, and I am in the firing line." Then, in a panic, I set off down the trench. Reaching the first corner, I drew back sharply, and my heart stood still. For under the trench-board bridge, I saw a dark form pressed against the side of the trench. In horror, I glued my eyes upon it. The light was growing stronger, and it was quite distinct. And now I thought I saw a stealthy movement. Drawing my revolver, and with just my head round the bend, I challenged it in a low voice. There was no reply, and again I muttered, "Who goes there?" Still silence, and with my gun well forward I advanced and prodded an old greatcoat hung on the trench side. My relief at this anticlimax cheered me somewhat. Nevertheless, I hurried down that part of the trench to the first post, where I stood beside Corporal Wood until Sergeant Alsop arrived, apologising for being late. For what seemed an eternity, we walked up and down the trench, until with great relief I saw that it was 4 a.m. and I was able to go in and wake Hatwell. After 1 or 2 more whiskies, I turned in and fell asleep in a moment. February 15th. At about 8 a.m., Hatwell woke me by shouting excitedly into the dugout. At first I was greatly alarmed, but seeing Dunham and Martin quietly preparing breakfast, I took no notice until he came in and worried me to go out into the trench. When he got me out, he waved his arm towards the distance beyond the Boche lines. Now isn't that beautiful? How can you lie hogging it on such a morning? I cursed him heartily. It was indeed a very nice morning, but he had not called me out because he wanted me to see it. It was because he was jealous of my being asleep while he was on duty. As I turned to re-enter the dugout, he said, "There's a job for you tonight." And he pointed out a cluster or corpses 3 or 4 yards behind the parados, lying flat on their backs, with marble faces rigid and calm, their khaki lightly covered with frost, some with no wound visible, some with blood clotted on their clothes, one with a perfectly black face. They lay at attention, staring up into the heavens. This was my first sight of dead men, and I was surprised that it did not upset me. Only the one with the black face has stayed with me. The thick, slightly curled lips, fleshy aquiline nose, cap comforter pulled well down over his head, and the big glassy eyes have become stamped on my brain. Re-entering the dugout, we sat down to breakfast, and with the bright sunlight streaming through the doorway, heartily did we enjoy the hot sausage and bacon that Martin laid before us. To me, at least, the blue sky and bright air came as a wonderful relief after the never-ending night. After breakfast, I again went outside, and looking along the trench, could see in the distance a small town almost hidden amongst the trees, with the sun gleaming on the red roofs and stray patches of snow. This was the ancient town of Peronne, in the hands of the Germans. It was now my turn for duty again, but during the day it is not necessary for us to remain in the line, as many of the posts are withdrawn and movement is not encouraged. As I mooned idly along, I picked up a tin hat lying on the parapet. Turning it over, I found the inside all gluey with blood, a small hole in one side showing where the bullet had entered. The coat which had frightened me last night had obviously been taken from a casualty, for the arm and side were ripped open and it was drenched with blood. As I moved on, I found that this portion of trench ran towards the Boche and seemed to be open to their view. I therefore crouched nearly double and hurried along to the first post. In this posture I turned the corner and ran into Corporal Sisserman, standing erect with rifle slung. He could not restrain his laughter, and blushingly I confessed that I was ignorant of the position and doubtful of the wisdom of walking erect. Being assured that it was quite safe, I continued my tour of the line, walking freely. On reaching the left post, I returned by the shortcut, climbing out of the trench over a huge rock which had blocked the junction of the switch. As I jumped into the trench by HQ, Hatwell cursed Martin for a double-dyed idiot. He was preparing our lunch, and from the brazier a steady column of smoke was pouring above the parapet. Martin was not a bit disturbed, and told Hattie that the sooner he went in and had his lunch, the sooner the fire could be put out. So in we went, and an excellent lunch of fried steak was presented. As we ate it, we revelled in the golden sunshine and blue sky, and listened to the cheerful and caustic banter passing between Martin, Dunham and Davies, who sat in the trench eating their own food. We were just finishing, when Martin gave a yell of warning and threw himself on his face. In a moment the trench wall opposite blew up, filling the dugout with dirt and fumes. 2 or 3 more explosions followed, and the servants came tumbling in, choking with dust and laughter. There was quiet for a few seconds, and then with a thud, a great grey-blue shell landed with a thud on the parados, rolled over and lay still. Hatwell at once wrote the word minis on a message pad, speared it with a fork and chucked it down the shaft to the signallers. These shells were 42-inch Minenwerfers, very destructive projectiles fired from a trench mortar. Their effect is so devastating and demoralising that whenever they are used, we inform our artillery, who plaster the enemy lines heavily in retaliation. The idea is that their infantry will know that every time the mortars are used, they will catch out for it, so the weapon is most unpopular and its use is becoming rarer. For the remainder of the afternoon, our guns kept up a continual plastering of the enemy support trenches, We were left in peace, and only one incident marked the next trip I took into the open. I had decided to walk round the line, and started by traversing the short cut across the open. I had walked fairly leisurely along the shallow trench and was climbing over the fallen rock, when my foot slipped and I fell into the front line. Even as I fell, there was a crack and a chip of rock flew off. A sniper must have had me spotted all the time, and my slip was an act of providence, though the sniper must have patted himself on the back for securing another victim. Obviously, I must not use the shortcut again in daylight. When my tour of duty came round, I drew 1 or 2 men from the posts and went out to bury the bodies. It was very dark, and we had to feel about to find them. When we tried to dig, we found the ground so hard that we could not get a pick into it. According to orders also, we tried to take off their boots and equipment, but it was not very pleasant pulling frozen corpses about. So we decided that the country could afford to pay for that equipment. And we ended by covering them with old blankets and piling the corners with stones, until the ground should be soft enough to bury them. February 16th. This morning, carrying out a few improvements to our dugout, we started to level up the ground under our table, which is very rickety. The earth was spongy, and we started digging with entrenching tools, but we struck an old blue tunic, and when we gave it a tug, the resistance and an unpleasant smell warned us that we had a guest, so we apologized and patted the earth back. As we replaced the table, a message was brought up by a signaller that I was to report to HQ at 6 p.m. to proceed on a course. So at 5 o'clock I filled my pack and set off with Dunham. The battalion HQ dugout, being about 30 steps down, was very fuggy, no ventilation, except the staircase which was screened by 3 blankets, a charcoal brazier glowing like a furnace, and 12 human beings living there. I stayed only long enough to get my papers and have a drink, but even then my head was throbbing when I climbed out with Thatcher of C Company, who is also going on the course, a refresher course in all subjects at the 48th Divisional School near Amiens. When we reached the Herbecourt Road, it seemed weeks since we had last seen it, and familiarity having bred contempt, we walked slowly, occasionally resting and watching the ration parties trudging by. At 9 p.m. we reached Cappy and took up our abode in an empty house whither our servants brought our kit from the battalion dump. After a small meal of bully, we turned in. It must have been about midnight when I woke with violent pains in my tummy. I suffered agonies which grew worse and worse until I was hardly conscious. I groaned and rolled about until Thatcher thought as I did that I was going to die. Then at about 3 a.m. I was violently sick and the pain subdued. I think it must have been due to bad food or water. In any case, I was quite fit in the morning. February 17th. We reported in the space outside the church, where were assembled 2 officers and servants from each battalion in the division. We climbed into lorries and drove through Bray, Corby and Querion to St. Gratien, where the school is established in the grounds of a chateau. The mess is in the castle, and we sleep in Nissen huts in the wooded park. February 18th. Sunday. Attended Mass in the church of a tiny village which has obviously supported itself by catering for the chateau. After lunch, Thatcher and I had a pleasant walk through the village and out into the country, which is very charming. The snow has gone and the hillsides are delightfully green and fresh, dotted here and there with small copses and red-roofed isolated farms. February 19th, March 9th. The course we are attending is typical of many which are continually running at similar places in the back areas. Its object is to keep officers in touch with those subjects of training which are necessarily neglected when in the line, particularly squad drill, company drill, musketry training and physical training. It may be refreshing for those who have been in the line for a long time, but being fresh from England, I find it very boring. On Saturdays and Sundays, we are able to get into Amiens, where we have most enjoyable times. We revel in hot baths and delightful meals, and occasionally a little flirtation. I have made friends with a dear little girl in a jewellery and gramophone shop in the arcade. We often call in and hear a few records, taking her a little gift of sweets. Once I met Bun of the Gloucesters, who told me that Frank was stationed close by and often came into the town, but I never ran across him. I paid many visits to the cathedral, which is very beautiful and dignified. We have also explored every part of the town and had meals or drinks in every hotel and cafe. Each Friday night we have a concert in the big salon of the chateau. I have sung at these, but was not a success. A rumour was circulated towards the end of the second week that our line was about to advance, and on Friday, March 2nd, we were warned to be prepared to join our units on Sunday. This attack did not, however, materialise, and we completed the full 3 weeks of the course. March 10th, departed in the lorry at 11 a.m. and bribed the driver to have a breakdown in Corby, where we had an excellent lunch in an excellenter club kept by 2 most excellentest little French girls. Then we proceeded to Cappy, where we were dumped outside the church. Leaving our servants sitting on our kit, we walked on to Éclusiers, where we were told our transport was stationed while the battalion was in the line. In an old billet on the canal bank, we found the quartermaster, Harding, the French interpreter, Talon, and Captain Billy Kentish, whom I knew in England, and who has been in hospital for a few days with a metal chip in his eye. We dispatched the mess cart for our kit and were just sitting down to tea when we heard the sound of Archies overhead. Running out, we saw the pink bursts surrounding a Bosch aeroplane which was heading straight for a kite balloon hovering above us. He made 1 circle, 1 dive, and then sped back to his lines. A wreath of smoke appeared, and then the balloon burst into flames. We saw the 2 observers climb out of the basket and drop. Their parachutes opened and very slowly they commenced to descend. But there was no wind to carry them away, and after a few agonizing seconds the balloon collapsed, and falling directly upon them bore them to the ground in its flaming folds, a few 100 yards from our hut. One of the men, covered in flames and blinded, crawled out and collapsed. The other could not be reached, but his part soon burnt out, leaving him alive. He died, unconscious, at 7 p.m. The other is still alive. Almost simultaneously with ours, 4 other balloons in the distance came down in flames. I learned that Hatwell is on leave in England, and that Anstey has taken over our company, which is holding the front line just on the right of the dugout, which I had been in during my last tour. March 11th, Sunday. Thatcher and I sorted out our trench kit during the morning, and at 3 p.m. started with our servants to walk up to the line. As we left Éclusiers, we saw a Bosch plane making for the balloon which had ascended in place of the one burnt yesterday. But as soon as he approached, a circle of anti-aircraft fire was opened around the OBSO, and although he dived down, he did not fire it. The observers, however, were not taking any chances. They jumped out and with their parachutes floated away before a strong wind towards the line. As we reached Herbecourt, we met them returning very red in the face, in an RFC tender which had followed them. On reaching Herbecourt, we called in at the divisional soup kitchen. These soup kitchens are established on one of the main roads whenever the division is in the line. The idea is that any troops who are returning from the trenches, tired, cold and hungry, can call in and have a can of mysterious broth, which, if of doubtful composition, is at least hot and revivifying. Here we learnt that the general opinion was that the Boche was shortly going to retire, and for that reason was destroying our balloons, so that we could not observe his movements. We were also warned that there had been heavy shelling in front of the village, and were advised to wait a bit. At this moment, there were 4 loud crashes further along the road, and a cloud of yellow and red dust marked the object of Jerry's hate, a new battery of 60-pound guns. However, we decided to push on, and fortune favoured the bold, for with our approach the shelling stopped. It was really asking for trouble to walk down the road in the open, and as we were halfway down the ridge, a battery spoke in the distance. A salvo of shells crashed about us, and we ducked into shell holes, hoping this was but a casual burst. But more and more followed, so we ran across the open field to the right as hard as we could go. We jumped into an isolated bit of trench, where a colonel joined us. He told us he was passing our battalion HQ and offered to show us the way. So together we walked across the shell-pitted fields until we came to a battery of 18-pounders. Beside it was our HQ, where we arrived just in time to join the commanding officer and adjutant at tea. Whilst we were eating, the pioneer sergeant brought in some crosses which he had made for the men whom I had covered with blankets and who were now buried. And when I went on to the front line, Dunham carried them along. In an old cellar I found Watkins and an older fellow, attached from the 25th Londons, and chatted to them until Stand 2. Stand 2 is the name given to the period of 1 hour, during which every soldier in the front line is on the alert. It takes place twice a day, the hour before sunrise and the hour after sunset. During these eerie periods of twilight, when normally all living things are just awaking or settling down for the night, the air is full of strange noises, the light is dim and deceptive, and all things are most favourable for an attack. As a precaution, therefore, every officer and man gets into fighting order, and for a solid hour remains at his post on the parapet, with rifle loaded and bayonet fixed, until either day had broken or darkness descended, and the order to stand down is passed along. Watkins was on duty first from 6 p.m, and I relieved him at 10 p.m. Sergeant Hughes was my NCO, and I went out into the trench as he arrived. The rain has set in now, and all snow has long since disappeared. The trench sides are falling in, and the mud is up to our waists. It is impossible to walk through it, and the only way to progress is to bury our arms in the sloppy mud of the trench sides and drag ourselves along. We have still one post on the left of our dugout, and this we visited. Then, as I had not been round the trench on the right, I let Hughes take the lead and dragged myself after him for about 10 yards, where he stopped and whispered to me that we were going straight on along the support trench, but that on our left was a trench leading forward to post number 5, by which we would return. The rain was pouring down, and we were already soaked through. As we loosened ourselves in the mud to continue our round, there was a faint pop in the distance like a blank cartridge, followed by a rapid whistle and the sharp crack and flash of a bomb bursting about 5 yards away. Even as we ducked, there was another pop, and another bomb burst in the same place. As we crouched low in the mud, they continued to fall about us, and Hughes whispered that they were Granatenwerfers called by Yussa blue pigeons or pineapples. He said that the sound of our squelching through the mud was perfectly audible in Jerry's line, and he would follow us with these bombs until we reached our right post, when he would open with a machine gun. In no wise cheered by this prediction, I told him to push on, and we continued to drag one leg after the other very, very slowly through the rain and darkness, ducking every few seconds as a singing, blinding crash flung 50 red-hot fragments about us. For about 100 yards we proceeded thus, and then we had to climb over an old iron pump which had fallen across the trench. While I was getting over, my tin hat fell onto it with a nerve-shattering clang, and as I stooped to retrieve it, an angry burst of machine gun fire swept over our heads, whilst a perfect hurricane of bombs fell about us. Several of them fell within 2 yards of us, but owing to the mud we were unhurt, one dud actually falling between us, and a few inches from where our faces were pressed into the side of the trench. Another 50 yards, pursued in terror and with many prostrations, brought us to a voice, low and trembling, which commanded us to halt. It was Corporal Johnson who told me that his post was a few yards further on. In order to reach it, we had to cross an open sunken road, along which a German machine gun was trained almost at point-blank range. I waited while Hughes went across it at top speed. He had hardly set a foot on it when there was a violent crackling and spitting as bullets swept past us from a machine gun 30 yards away. With my heart in my mouth, I waited until the burst ceased, and then rushed across as fast as my casing of mud would allow me. As I reached the shelter of the trench on the other side, the first rattle of bullets swept past. The poor lads on this post were windy. The long night of rain and darkness, the incessant bursting of pineapples and bursts of gunfire, added to the loneliness, the strain of watching, the enforced silence and the nearness of the Germans had played havoc with their nerves. I stopped for some time and tried to cheer them up in whispers, before I moved forward up the short trench to the post in front. Here we were, right on top of the Boche, and could move only by inches and breathe remarks. As I crouched beside the sentries, I could quite distinctly hear the German sentries talking in low voices, and an occasional burst of flame showed that the machine gun was only about a dozen yards in front. We were now obliged to recross the road, and much closer to the gun, but the road surface was so much harder that we were able to rush across together before he could switch his fire on us. So we reached the third post, March 12th. This post was a perfectly circular hole, around which the 6 men lay in a little ring, the sentries peering over the top, the remainder huddled together chattering with cold and nerves. Corporal Bennett was in command, and he appeared to have thorough wind-up. When I had spoken a few words to them and was moving in down the trench, he came after me and asked if he could be relieved, as he had lost his nerve. He was shaking with fear, and I felt very sorry for him, but knowing that he would have to stick it, and that if I showed any clemency the rot would spread, I told him he was to return to his post at once and set an example to his men instead of creeping away to ask to be allowed to run away from danger. This steadied him up, and he lost his nervous trembling. Pulling himself together, he apologized in a firm voice, saying that he could not understand why he had cracked up then, as he had been in much hotter places without turning a hair. I told him not to worry and went on to number 4 post. The rain had now ceased, and it was growing much lighter. The trench here, where Corporals Mackay and Sisserman had post numbers 4 and 5, was much deeper, and the men were fairly well sheltered. A German machine gun was, however, trained across this section, and incessantly sent mud flying over us as we plodded along. After passing the 5th post, the trench bent sharply back and grew very shallow. We crawled in the mud on our hands and knees under a coil of French concertina, which had dropped in from the wire entanglement above. We were now back in the control trench outside our cellar. Our 300-yard tour of duty had taken 3.5 hours, and now I just had time to revisit number 6 post when my time was up. I took Hughes with me into the dugout and poured out a stiff tot of rum for each of us. Then, sitting by the huge glowing brazier, I commenced removing with a stick the 2 inches of slimy mud that encased me from the waist down and from shoulders to wrists. After a few minutes, Sergeant Bell looked in, and I woke Holmes, who shuffled out into the night. Sergeant Hughes finished his rum and went out too, leaving me alone with the fire and the rum. My revolver was choked with mud, and I had to clean it before I could turn in, and this I did, sitting on one chair with my feet on another, and the glowing brazier beneath my legs caking the mud upon me. Finally, slightly loosening my equipment, and laying my tin hat and open gas helmet one on either side of my head, soaked and shivering outside, but glowing with rum inside, I fell asleep to the sound of thuds and explosions outside, and the rustle of magazine pages from the signallers down the shaft. I was only able to sleep for about 4 hours, as I had to be out for stand 2 at 6 a.m. However, it was a beautiful morning, and as we cannot move about in daylight, we do not have to do any duty during the day. Going into the cellar after stand down, I found Holmes making out a casualty report. When we had reached number 3 post, he had found Corporal Bennett dead, with 3 men. The other 3 men of the post were wounded. A few minutes after I had left them, a bomb had fallen amongst them. I told Holmes about Bennett's nervousness and sudden return to fatalism, and we agreed that he must have had a premonition. We were very quiet during the day. Jerry left us severely alone, although his aeroplanes were over all day. During the afternoon, a message came through that we would be relieved tomorrow by the 7th Battalion. The night, too, was very much quieter, although another bomb fell in number 3, post killing 1 and wounding 2. The machine gun was farther back and less active. During my tour, I buried the 4 casualties of last night, in shell holes behind the post where they were killed. After coming off duty, I was lying alone in the straw and just dozing off, when I heard someone stop outside the cellar. Sitting up, I saw the blanket slowly lifted, and a head appeared in the dim light of the candle. I hardly repressed a scream of horror, and an icy numbness gripped me as I scanned a blackened face, thick lips and aquiline nose, big eyes that stared at me, and a cap comforter drawn down almost to the eyebrows. It was the face of the dead man that I had buried. For fully half a minute we looked in silence at each other. Then he asked me if I could tell him what time the rations would be up. I laughed hysterically and made him come in so that I could dispel by conversation the awful fright that his appearance had given me. It was Corporal Harrison, his face blackened with wood smoke, but his every feature identical with that of the corpse. March 13th. We had only sufficient rations to give us a very small breakfast, and then nothing was left over for the rest of the day. But we did not mind, for we were to be relieved at 7 p.m., a thought which made us very bright and cheerful throughout the day. At 5 p.m., as we sat in our dugout, a message in Playfair code was handed up by a signaller. It took some time to decipher, and it was 5:15 p.m. when Holmes read out the following message. Our heavy artillery will bombard enemy front lines, commencing 5:20 p.m. Withdraw advanced posts. Of course it was impossible to withdraw our posts, which were half an hour's crawl away, and it would have been foolish to attempt it. So we resumed our various occupations, Holmes making out a report, Watkins packing his kit, and I drawing a map of the trench in my field message book. At 5:20 a series of thuds was heard in the distance. Holmes murmured, "They're off," and we waited for the shells to pass over. A second layer then came, whistling and moaning at first, then with a shriek and roar growing louder and louder, until with devastating crashes they exploded 30 yards behind us. As we stared at each other in horror, another salvo came, crash, 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 with earth-shaking explosions on top of us. The air hummed with fragments and acrid yellow fumes rolled down into the cellar. Now they rained upon us. All along the trench we could hear them falling, as we sat with fixed grins upon our faces, trembling in every limb. Holmes grabbed a pencil and scribbled a message, but as he crossed to the signaller's shaft, a louder, fiercer screech swooped upon us, and a terrific crash flung us in all directions and into darkness. It felt quite pleasant to be dead. There was such utter quiet and peacefulness, just a light singing in my ears, restful blackness around me, and a sense of absolute freedom and abandon. I seemed to be standing up, and stretching out my arms I encountered, with a slight disappointment, a brick wall. Childishly I commenced to trace the patterns of the bricks with my fingers. Then I heard a loud crash 30 feet away, and Holmes's voice saying, "Is anybody hurt?" I just realized that my mouth was full of dust, and that there was a big patch of light showing through the roof, when Holmes struck a match and relit the candle. We had had a miraculous escape, for the shell had hit the corner of the cellar and blown it in. The flying bricks and shell fragments had spattered the walls, but no one had been touched except Brown Holmes's servant, who had been hit in the back by a flying brick. Our guns had now ceased fire, but we could hear them receiving a few shells from the Germans. I now found that during the few seconds when I had believed myself dead, I had closed my notebook, snapped round the elastic, and returned the pencil to its socket. Well, all was quiet now, and it was 6 p.m. We had only an hour before our relief was due, so Holmes sent Brown along to the neighbouring dugout to fetch Sergeant Phillips for his orders, whilst Watkins and I commenced to plug up the gaping hole in our roof with sandbags to prevent the light shining through. It was now quite dark. After a few minutes, Brown returned, rather white in the face, saying that he could not find the NCO's dugout. This was only 10 yards away, and consisted of an unfinished shaft of a few steps leading to a tiny excavation in which there was just room for 3 or 4 men to sit. Holmes guessed that Brown was shaken up by the shelling, so he laughed and said, "Come on then, I'll help you to search for it. Perhaps someone's pinched it." And they set off together down the muddy trench. I was just finishing off the roof when Brown came tumbling in, moaning and laughing hysterically. He stared at me, screaming, "Oh God, it is! It is!" Then we slung him in a chair, gave him a tot of rum, and ran off down the trench to the mine shaft, which had been occupied by Sergeant Phillips, Sergeant Bennett, Corporal Everett, and Corporal Hollins. The last of the shells had obviously burst inside the shaft, for the entrance was completely blocked, and the top of the shelter was lying across the trench. In the faint light that still remained, we saw the sandbags and pieces of timber half buried in the mud. Holmes stooped to raise one of these short beams, then let it go with a shuddering exclamation, for he had bent back an arm with sergeant's stripes. There was a narrow gap through the blockage, and we shouted down through it, but our voices sank into the wet earth, and there was no sound from below. So we returned to the cellar to discuss the matter, and found Brown, gibbering and chattering like a monkey. First of all, we wired off the casualties to Anstey in code, and then we went for the next senior NCO of each platoon. We explained to them what had happened and instructed them to take charge of their platoons and carry out the relief without letting the men know about the casualties. These NCOs were very badly shaken by the news, and particularly by the deaths of the two brothers Bennett in succeeding days. There is a third brother in the company who is due back from leave tomorrow. We sent the NCOs back to their posts, and then decided that as it was nearly 7 p.m. and the relief would be in at any moment, we would be foolish to start getting the bodies out in a narrow trench through which the two companies would have to pass. So we left them, and when Anthony, the relieving captain of the 7th Warwicks, arrived, we told him about it. He not only agreed to leave them for the moment, but infuriated me by treating the matter as a joke. I had just finished handing over when Wales, the brigade trench mortar officer, looked in for a drink. He was going my way, so we set out together. As the trench was so bad, we went across the top, passing by the graves of Underwood and the other men killed in the raid of February 4th. I had just begun to realise how hungry and tired I was, and as I turned my back on the horrors of the line, I thought of the food and warmth and sleep that awaited me at the rear. My heart began to glow and my head sang. Out of it! Out of it! In 2 hours I'll be home! As we picked our way round shell holes and barbed wire, we heard the pineapples begin to fall along the line. So we paused to watch their vivid flashes, until a sudden glare in the distance, followed by a whirl and rush, planted a couple of high-velocity shells 50 yards away, and we pushed on, jumping into the support trench outside Company HQ. Down 30-odd steps, I found Anstey in a small, hot dugout, heavy with the smell of steak and onions, which made my mouth water and my eyes bulge. I reported that my platoon relief was complete, and as I was supposed to depart, he called me back and said, "I suppose the bodies have been buried?" I explained, of course, how the situation had made it impossible. He agreed that it had been, but, he added, it is not impossible now. He said that they must be buried before we left, and rushed a runner off to the main trench to collect any men of our company he could find and bring them back. Meanwhile, he invited me to share his steak and onions, saying that when Watkins and Holmes arrived, we would toss up which of us should remain behind for the gruesome task. I gladly accepted the offer of a meal, but pointed out that the others had been in the line for 7 days, and I only 3, so with his permission we would let them go off in ignorance of the job in hand. He agreed, and when they reported relief complete, I said I was waiting for Anstey, and they went on home. A few minutes later we sat down to the table, and a servant placed before us a wonderful plate of steak. At the same moment the runner returned, reporting that Sergeant Hughes and 6 men were waiting outside in the trench. Anstey gave them instructions to go and commence work, and I would join them in a few minutes. Then, with a thrill of anticipation, I drew my plate towards me. Alas, too near. The newspaper tablecloth stuck out some inches from the table, and onto this I pulled my plate, which capsized, sending my savoury meal into 6 inches of mud and water around our feet. I wanted very much to cry, and when Anstey offered me a share of his, I shook my head. I took a hunk of bread and cheese and had just broken off a piece when a voice came down the steps. "Sergeant Hughes has sprained his leg in the trench, sir, and can't move." I laid down my bread with a sigh, and gulping down half a tumbler of neat whisky, passed up the steps amid the stream of smoke which continuously poured out. As I gained the open air, and paused to choke down the lumps of disappointment that kept swelling in my throat, the parapet in front leapt up in a sheet of fire with a double crash. They had started shelling again, and bending double I ran down the trench to where a group of men hugged the side of the riveted fire bay in dead silence. I tried, unsuccessfully, to get Hughes to move. He said it was an old knee injury, and that he could not possibly move, but that if we left him, he would crawl back to an aid post as best he could. I could not afford to leave a man with him, so I left him, and in a moment he was hurrying back along the trench, while we plodded in dreary silence up to the line we had left in such glee an hour before. We started at once to pull away the wreckage of the entrance, and had just come to Sergeant Phillips, when Jerry started his blue pigeon strafe. Amidst their flashes and crumps, we pulled him out and laid him behind the parapet. He had been killed by the dugout falling in as he ran up the steps, for there was no wound on his body, but his head was crushed by the weight of sandbags and timber from the roof. 2 men started to bury him, while we returned to the more horrible task of excavation. As we worked down the sides, we realized, in the darkness, that the beams and sides were splashed with blood and flesh, The stench of lyddite and fresh blood was ghastly, and the foulness of our groping in the dark cannot be described. At last we could stand it no longer, and regardless of consequences, we lit a candle and commenced working by its shaded light. This evoked a shower of pineapples and bullets which continued to fall until we had cleared the shaft. Of Corporal Everett we found no trace. He must have been struck by the shell and blown to atoms. Bennett was badly shattered, and most of his head was gone, whilst Hollins, who had been sitting with his rifle between his knees, was unrecognisable, and the twisted rifle was buried in the front of his body. March 14th. It was early morning when we got them all out. Anstey had arrived, and he helped me to remove their papers and identification discs. Then we buried them in shell holes and walled in the dugouts with earth and sandbags. When this was done, we sent the men on home and went into our old cellar to have a long peg of whiskey with Anthony. As we left the cellar and climbed out onto the top, I was forced to pause and moralise, gazing over the vaguely visible line of trench, to think of the mad fate which dragged simple, kind-hearted men into these nights of terror and destruction. Mostly my mind was occupied with the third Bennett, who was by now waiting at our transport lines. I pictured him returning with messages from home for his two brothers, and the terrible shock it would be when he found that both were dead. From where I stood, I could faintly see the roughness of the ground which marked where they were lying 100 yards apart. Turning into the shallow trench, where I had been so nearly sniped during my first tour, we struck across behind B Company's sector into a sunken road, the continuation of the Herbecourt Road. Here there was another German machine gun, which fired occasional bursts. As it was now growing lighter, we hurried on, zigzagging round shell holes and hugging the bank until we were quite winded. We rested for a few minutes in a trench which cut the road, and then attacked the final spurt which had to take us over the ridge before the sun rose. As we hurried on, our packs growing heavier at every step, the sky in the east grew redder and redder until it changed to the white light of dawn, and just as we could say that it was really daylight, we crossed the ridge and were safe. Stretched by the side of the road, we found our burying party, thoroughly exhausted. We shouted a few cheery words to them and passed on. At Herbecourt Soup Kitchen we paused for a rest, and I tried to swallow some cabbage soup. But as the only food I had had in 24 hours was a half slice of bread and a piece of bacon, the greasy liquid made me feel sick, and I left it. The morning was clear, bright and delightful. Outside the soup kitchen was an ambulance, and a motor bus which had been converted into a pigeon loft around which the pigeons were fluttering and cooing. The drivers were asleep in the ambulance, and there was no other sign of life. Asking the cook to be kind to our fellows when they arrived, we set off again, warmed by the rising sun and feeling very happy. We were out of the mud and muck, away from the bombs and shells, the rain and darkness, the blood and smells. Out in the free air where we could walk erect and talk aloud. The wonderful freedom drove away our weariness and our hunger. With our heavy packs we ran and jumped over shell holes, laughed and sang, and drawing our revolvers, potted at birds which shrugged their shoulders and flew off. When a general service wagon met us, and the driver said that he had been sent to carry us back, we laughed merrily, telling him to go on and pick up our troops, and we would be at Éclusiers 2 hours before him. March 15th. March. Arose at 9 a.m., having slept the clock round. We did no work all day, but held an inspection of rifles, gas helmets, and iron rations. In the afternoon we went into a quarry and potted at tins with our revolvers. Anstey had been up last night and got very tight. He was not at all washed out by the tour in the line, but I was very nervy and ducked every time I heard a sharp noise. March 16th. Did no work during the day, but at dusk moved up to Herbecourt to mend roads. I suffered from an extraordinary delusion on this occasion. Before we left, Kentish, who was to command the working party, showed me the map and pointed out the place where we were to work the road from Herbecourt to Flocourt. It was bitterly cold, and I was not pleased at the thought of standing about in the darkness for hours. But then the picture of Flocourt came into my mind. I imagined our arrival there after working along the cold, wet road, the warm glow of the windows, the smell of the coffee shops and epiceries, and the rosy, warmly clad villagers who would greet us. The picture made me quite cheery, although in my sane mind I knew that the village is razed to the earth, being only just behind the line. Still, all the way up the Herbecourt Road, the image remained with me and kept me cheerful. The snow had returned, and the ground was covered in a thin white sheet. In front of Herbecourt we commenced work, filling up shell holes and levelling bumps. It was a very irritating task, especially as no smoking was allowed, and progress was very slow. At about midnight I went with Kentish to the soup kitchen to arrange for the men to have a meal when they had finished work. Here we found 8 or 10 men who had sneaked off from their work in the dark. Billy took their names and sent them back. As we progressed along the road, it became evident that we would not reach Flocourt that night. So leaving my men at work, I walked on myself to see my little Christmas card village. The road here was more torn and pitted than ever, and after a quarter of an hour, I found myself standing on top of a trench system, which ran around the foundations and ruins of some houses. Not a single wall was standing. All was a jumbled mass of broken brick and twisted iron. This was my village, and I could have wept with disappointment. As I turned to go, I heard someone coming through the village, and I waited so as to have company on my return. It was a private of the 4th Gloucesters, slightly wounded and very jubilant. "Do you know, sir?" he cried. "We've got their lines." I told him I had not heard of any attack, and he shook his head knowingly. "There was none, sir. We thought, do you see, that they was very quiet, so we showed ourselves a little bit at first and nothing happened. Then we sent a fella out just before dark. He walked slowly across, waiting for a shot to be fired, but none came. He went on over their first line and over their second, and then when he reached the 3rd line we all went over. There wasn't a jerry anywhere except a few stiffs. They've gone clean back over the canal, and the trenches they had, why, sir, we was living in muck to them." I asked him how he was wounded if there were no Germans, and he became suddenly serious. "Ah, sir," he replied, "we've lost a lot of good fellies. The trenches were left full of booby traps. All I did was to pick up a Hun's helmet from the floor of the trench, and a bomb went off underneath. Lucky for me, sir, that it was buried, and I only got it slightly. You'll perhaps know Mr. Harcourt of the 6th Warwick, sir. Well, he's bought it. They went over on our right at the same time, and he went down a dugout, but as soon as he put his hand on the handrail, the 2 bottom steps blew up and took both his legs off. He died before they could get him away. Poor old Harcourt. He was bound for Blighty in a couple of days' time, though from what I saw of him he is booked for the best of Blighties. When we reached my working party, I left the wounded Gloucester to tell his news to my troops. They did not betray the slightest excitement. With only a mild interest, they inquired, "Plenty of souvenirs?" What to me was the glorious rout of the enemy and retreat of the Imperial Army meant to them more blank marching. March 17th. At 2 a.m. we finished work and sent the troops back to the soup kitchen, leaving them to have a meal and a rest, and then find their own way back to the billets. Then, spotting an inviting glow from a dugout, Kentish and I went in to cadge a drink. We found that it was occupied by some officers of the engineers, who were on the point of departing to construct a bridge across the Somme Canal where the enemy had retreated. They told us that the retirement had been expected for a long time, and that they had had the bridging materials ready behind the line. When we reached our billets, we learnt that A and C companies had already moved up to the pursuit of the Huns. Company was at that moment 4 a.m. preparing to take Peronne, and we were to move up later in the day. I slept from 4 to 9 a.m. and then got busy supervising the cleaning of billets, issue of rations and packing of kits. At 5 p.m. we marched up the Canal Bank Road, led by Anstey. It poured with rain and was very dark. Soon we followed Anstey into a little wood. We passed in single file beneath the dripping trees for 100 yards, then halted in an open clearing. I heard no orders given, but suddenly found that the troops had melted away. I was left alone, marvelling at the manner in which they seem to divine instinctively where their positions are, and go to them without being shown. I sat on a wet tree stump, looking round at the snowing slush and the shell-bitten trees, until Anstey returned with Dunham, and I followed him to what appeared to be a trapdoor into the ground. Descending a short wooden ladder, we entered a gallery, lighted by the rays of a lamp burning in a small room with glass-panelled doors on the left. In this dugout we found Captain Taylor, commanding A Company, which we were relieving. Before he left, he gave us a very long-winded account of the day's events. The Boche retirement, long anticipated by our HQ, had taken place just before dawn on the 16th. At dusk, the 4th Gloucester and our 6th Battalion had gone over into their lines, but had been held up at the canal as the bridges had been destroyed. Pontoon boats had then been provided by the Royal Engineers, and our company had crossed at Halle, whence they marched to Sainte Radegonde, where they halted at 5 AMC Company, crossing in the same way, marched up past them along the main road to Peronne, which they entered unmolested except for a few snipers' bullets at 7:30 a.m. on St. Patrick's Day. The positions which we were taking over now were in reserve, and Taylor was going forward to establish his HQ in Halle. After Taylor had left, Anstey rose, saying that he had to return to Battalion HQ for a conference and would not return that night. So I proceeded to turn the dugout into a home by opening my pack and disposing around me my raincoat, some cigarettes and bits of chocolate, my Palgrave's Golden Treasury, and some Harrison Fisher girls, which I carried about to enliven such quarters as these.